Good evening, and it's now week 3, and we're looking at history and culture. The first part of the lecture will be on history, and then the second part will be on culture. And then next we go on to look at the other two parts of the sociological imagination, the structure and critique. So, what do I mean when I say you need to understand about history and the sociological imagination? Well, I guess it conjures up pictures of, facts and dates and school, and that's really boring. So it's not a knowledge of history for its own sake. I mean, that has its own, there's a good reasons why you might want to learn more about history and look at the history of the world. But the thing we're trying to develop in sociology in particular is a historical sensibility. And William Faulkner puts it nicely in one of his works. He says, the past is never dead, it's not even past. So what we're trying to get you to understand is history is a process of change and how it impacts on the present. So a sociologist doing research is always asking, how did it get to be this way? Fortunately, though, in sort of getting a broad scope of history, then, Jared Diamond, the well-known evolutionary biologist, says that fortunately there's only, for us, there's only two really big things that happen in history. So you want to have a think about what the two really big things that happened in history were. So what we're interested in is history as a context. In the first lecture, I gave you that analogy of 800 lifetimes of 80 years. So that long, getting used to a long view and trying to get a conception of when we're making generalizations about humanity, the broad scope of those sort of things. So we have to be careful about those patterns. And I said then, that the first 650 lifetimes, if we divided human history of 50,000 years into lifetimes of 800 lifetimes of 80 years, then the first 650 lifetimes we lived as foragers in small groups, bands of 10 who came together in clan meetings to exchange partners and find wives and reproduce the clan, maybe in groups of a few hundred. So think about what that would mean to live that kind of lifestyle and what the implications are in terms of how they view things like private property. So a hunter might go out, but he's hunting for the tribe, not just for himself, and he might get, key cut of the thing, but the women will distribute it according to the kinship rules, which keep the whole clan going. The last 125 lifetimes saw one of the two big things that Jared Diamond's talking about, and that's the agricultural urban revolution, where people came together in what was seen at the time as large cities of maybe thousands of people, small groups of hundreds, maybe thousands of people, growing their own food, and the emergence of a class structure, an urban elite who controls what happens in the city. They have some sort of armed force at their disposal. There's probably a priesthood that's connected with that in some way, and so these large cities begin to emerge about 125 lifetimes ago. More recently then, the other second big thing that's happened is called the Great Transformation, the Industrial and French Revolutions. So here we're talking about the changes that created the modern world. And that was 3 lifetimes ago. And now we're talking about cities with hundreds of thousands of people, and this was the context in which sociology emerged to explain and understand those sort of massive changes. And it's very, very hard to get back behind that and look at this as a big picture kind of exercise. The notion is out of the French and Industrial Revolutions of democracy and mass production and consumption. The things that make perfect sense to us would not have made much sense to people who lived in periods more than 3 lifetimes ago. It's hard to convey just exactly how productive capitalism really is and what the implications of all that are. One way is to look at Eric Wolf's analogy. In the 18th century, an Indian hand spinner would take 50,000 hours to process 100 pounds of cotton. So 50,000 hours is 50 hours a week for 100 years, a lifetime. 100 pounds of cotton is a lifetime's work, and that's the Indian hand spinner in the 18th century, but that's for all of human history, really. That level of productivity in relation to creating cotton yarn, of course it didn't happen until we learn to grow cotton and spin it into yarn, so it doesn't go right back to the dawn of time. But in terms of human productivity, that's how much we could make on our own. And then in 1779, that thing that looks like a sort of giant twisted sewing machine. It's meant for someone to stand, so it's, a human-sized machine to sit at and work. So just in case the scale isn't too clear, and that machine could process the 100 pounds of cotton in 1779 to 2,000 hours, so say at the same rate, about a year. And by 1795 it was 300 hours, about 6 weeks. By the time 1825 rolls around, these machines were completely automated, and it was taking 135 hours to produce 100 pounds of cotton. So in 2.5 weeks, from 1830, machines could do in 2.5 weeks what would have taken a human being a lifetime to do. So it's hard to conceive just what a shift in awareness and productivity that really is. It's enormous productivity. And the machine, as you can see, is not incredibly sophisticated, by our standards. So how do we use history in sociology? Right? Where's the concrete? Well, I've tried to explain sociology to you in historical terms. From the first lecture, I just said, social theory emerged out of trying to explain those social changes. So when you look at a social theorist, you need to really ask yourself, well, in what historical context was he working? And it usually is a he. What were they looking at? Then the female theorists come along later. What were their issues? What were they looking at? When we say Marx got such and such a thing wrong, or this wasn't right, we have to think Marx was writing in the 1850s, so he's in the midst of those massive changes that were wrought by automation and this new machinery and this whole new way of life that emerged in the Industrial Revolution and the French Revolution. More concretely, my partner's just finished an honours thesis on domestic violence policy. Well, the first thing, if you're looking at domestic violence as an issue, you want to say, well, when did domestic violence first become an issue? And presumably there's been some form of domestic violence for a very long time, but it doesn't go back to the dawn of time. And the notion of, because the notion of a domestic sphere emerged with the Industrial Revolution. Prior to that, men and women worked together at home. They were peasants, they lived on the land, they may have had a farm, they worked a piece of land, and they lived and worked together in the house. So there wasn't a private sphere in the sense of what emerged with the Industrial Revolution was a man going out to work and a woman staying at home. Of course women worked, but that nuclear family pattern that we picture is of the man going out to work and the woman staying at home. So the house became a separate sphere, and it's in that sphere that the violence was hidden for a very long time. And then in terms of domestic violence policy and understanding of it as a public policy issue rather than a private trouble comes about with the women's movement, and particularly in the early 70s with the policies on domestic violence and what we do about regulating the private sphere. So to understand what's currently going on in domestic violence policy, we need to understand what's gone on in the past and how the issues have been constructed over time. I'm involved in the sustainability group, and I just enrolled in a sustainability course, free online course at Coursera, and so I'm becoming a student at the same time. And the importance of sustainability is a discourse. Sustainability is everywhere these days. People talk about sustainable profits, people talk about sustainable growth, people talk about sustainable environments. It's a word that's probably overused, but if we're going to look at it in terms of a topic of research, well, we want to know, where did this word come from? The standard definition is not to interact with the environment in a way that will affect future generations' capacity to make a living from that environment. So it's got that notion of future generations. Well, where did that definition come from, and how did that get settled on as the sort of United Nations definition? Last night I went to a meeting of the chiropractors here, and we're talking about how we can get together to do some research on how effective chiropractic is and how we're going to measure it and so forth. But my first reflex as a sociologist is to say, okay, what's the history of chiropractic? Where does it come from? It's different from medicine. When did that happen? When did it get separated? So, you have to go back to last century, the 19th century, and find where chiropractic emerged in competition with medicine, how it ran in a different paradigm that it operates, and how medicine emerged more and more, allopathic medicine emerged more and more as the dominant form, until now we have a health system that's dominated by medical practitioners. Nurses have made some inroads into that, but traditionally nurses have a very subservient role, very much like the private and public sphere that we talked about a minute ago, that caring work is women's work, and it's to be done under the direction of men, and that's how hospitals have operated until recently, with nurses becoming more professionalised. And of course chiropractic's in a similar competition with medicine about the treatment of particular back problems, and whether or not it has a role to play in a broader sense of well-being, and what the practitioners who have a range of views think. But the first thing is to get a sense of that history, what's been the play so far, where are we at in that process of professionalisation. So history always plays a role, but it's not that history of school that's so boring. And Willis has a whole lot of examples that I think make it pretty clear, so I wanted to sort of try to broaden it out a little bit. He makes a good case there for the need in a globalised world of having a multicultural view, a recognition that your own customs are as strange as other people's. We tend to look at other people's customs and go, oh, isn't that weird? Aren't other people's strange? And so in a certain sense, sociology needs to develop that reflexivity so that we can look at try to make our own customs seem strange. And that obviously takes some practice. There's an enormous tendency, as I also mentioned in the first lecture, he talks about technology. Technology is obviously very important for our way of life, and those technological changes wrought enormous changes. But what I want to sort of point you at is, you can look at that sort of superficially. I mean, clearly the world is very different because we have computers and the internet and mobile phones and automatic telemachines, and compact CDs are becoming a thing of the past. They're rapidly being replaced by other kinds of technology, and no one even remembers what a cassette tape is, or let alone a vinyl record. So there's those kind of technical changes that we all kind of live out. But what I'd encourage you to do is to sort of look deeper, because the culture has an enormous way, even when it is talking about history, it tends to see it a little bit like the Fred Flintstones. It tends to see it as people have always been the same, they just didn't have the technology. And what sociology wants to say is, well, people in different societies live and think in different cultures, they live in different structures, they have a different history, and what we need to develop is a historical understanding that the world was a very different place. It wasn't just the same with different technology. So the advent of that automating of, just the first example, the advent of that mule that could automate the process of making cotton that took us, I said, it took 100 pounds, took an Indian hand spinner a lifetime to produce 100 pounds of cotton. That wouldn't be a way, prior to the rise of those machines, 100 pounds of cotton would just be an impossible amount. That's all of the cotton you could use in your lifetime if you're a hand spinner. So people didn't think about a pile of 100 pounds of cotton, because that was just what they would use in their lifetime. It'd be like me saying to you, imagine how much water you're going to drink in a lifetime. It's just not, you don't measure things in those terms. And it's only the advent of machines where we can begin to convert 100 pounds of cotton into linen in 2 weeks. We can see 100 pounds of cotton become linen in the space of 2 weeks, that we begin to think about amounts like 100, 200, 500, thousands of tons of cotton. Those things only become thinkable when we have the machines that can convert them. So it doesn't just change, it's not just a matter of increasing productivity, it's not just a matter of quantities. We were talking about quantity and qualities before in research. It's about the qualitative change that shifts. It's a shift in the way people think and the way things are done. So things change, but they change in more radical ways than we're normally led to think. At school you might have been asked to, what was life like for children in ancient Greece? And of course there's some purpose to that exercise. It's useful to try to engage school children with those kind of exercises, to think about what children would have been doing in ancient Greece. But what happens if you discover that ancient Greece doesn't have our concept of childhood? So that's another level of thinking about it. They didn't have a concept of child in the way that we do. Childhood is a sort of period of innocence. For Greek elites, men having sex with men was the cultural norm. That was one of their key, ways of interacting with each other. But they weren't homosexual in the sense that we would understand that word. They weren't gay. They didn't have homosexual identities in the way that we see it as important. That's very much a post-19th century way of thinking about identity and thinking about homosexuality as a type of person. That didn't exist prior to the 19th century. Of course, men were having sex with men. But in all sorts of contexts, in contexts like ancient Greece, it was approved conduct, it was the cultural norm. But in many places in the Middle Ages in Europe, it was a death sentence. So societies have policed that behaviour in lots of different ways, but our modern understanding of it didn't emerge until quite recently. I could keep doing these. Cousin marriage was accepted. Now most people say you shouldn't marry your cousins, it might lead to birth defects or something. Charles Darwin, the famous evolutionary scientist, married his own cousin. In the 19th century it wasn't regarded as problematic. Ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, the elites, it was organised cousin marriage on a large scale in order to consolidate the power of the ancient Egyptian pharaohs and so on. So for them it wasn't a taboo topic. Drugs like cocaine and opium now are seen as hard drugs, like heroin, highly addictive and so on. But in the 19th century, a lot of well-known poets and artists and indeed people outside an artistic milieu used opium as a common drug, like tobacco, as snuff. So it could be sniffed or mixed with alcohol to form laudanum, and it could be addictive. And people, in Australia, it was associated with the Chinese who had been addicted to opium by the British Empire as a means of colonising them. It was a drug in widespread use, whereas now, and hence we know about Coca-Cola having cocaine and so on. The way we see those drugs is quite different than what it was seen even in the 19th century. And all of that we call modernity. What does it mean? I'm going to ask you to, in the context of your interview, to talk about people being a modern person. So I want to, having got that sense of you need to understand how things have changed, we call that process modernity. So I just wanted to elaborate the concept of modernity. Sociology is a modern discipline. How does that influence the way we think? So modernity is a product of those changes that I mentioned, the French and Industrial Revolution. A lot of it was associated with the Enlightenment, which was a social movement amongst intellectuals that sought to bring society under the control of reason. That human beings should be allowed to set their own standards for how things were conducted, and not defer to the church or to God or to religious practices of any kind, but to use their own senses and their own observations and make their own decisions about how life should be conducted, not defer to the king or to the priest, but to engage in a scientific process of rational discovery. And you can see that process is evident in the processes all cut across each other. These processes of mass production and these ways in which people are treated and the way things changed. And there's a couple of good ways to illustrate this, but I just want to keep this fairly short, so I'll give you the short one. But I really encourage you to look at the movie Baraka. It's a wonderful tableau of images from all around the world. It's a silent movie, just with these gorgeous pictures and a soundtrack. And on the Moodle site, I shall take a 15-minute excerpt from the movie, but I encourage you to see if you can track down a copy and have a look. It'll be online, of course. But just this 15-minute excerpt that shows that shift from essentially tribal ways or agricultural ways close to nature through the shift to modernity. But there's a simpler way to do it, perhaps, and that's to have a look at Charlie Chaplin. Right, so you can see there how he's captures a little bit of the sense of the whole movie of it, but just that sequence where he captures the whole notion of humans and machines gradually coming to dominate. So instead of them being a tool that we use, they start to use us, and so the rhythm of life is determined by the rhythm of the machine, and we become like a giant cog in a machine. We start to think of nature as a machine. It's like the universe is a giant clock, which is not an image that would have occurred to people prior to modern times. And then we see more and more with our own analogies. We create computers, and in the early days of working in computers, we'd say, well, these computers are a little bit like a human brain. They do these sort of things a bit like a brain. But after a while, it sort of flips over, and we start talking about, oh no, that the brain is very much like a computer. So we flip the analogy over, and the machine becomes the dominant one, and the humans become derivative. And this just has changes in all aspects of life. I don't want to elaborate too much about all the details, but let's think of what that means for your sense of time. Prior to modernity, even the early clocks just had hours, didn't have minutes. We didn't break time down. Whereas now we break time down into more and more small parts, and we have diaries with details, and we make smaller and smaller time distinctions, and of course computers do things with milliseconds. What does it mean that the world opens up in terms of train travel? With the invention of iron and steel, we begin to lay train tracks, and places open up, trade and transport open up in ways that weren't. You had ships that covered long distances, but internal things, and people could go travel and see other places, and travel became a possibility. Even electric light. Some people have argued that modern humans are eternally sleep deprived, because prior to that they got up with the sun, they went to bed with the sun. You didn't have any way of prolonging the day very much. You could have candles, but candles don't throw a whole lot of light, so people lived much closer to the rhythms of the sun, and when the sun went down there wasn't a lot you could do. But with electric light, the whole, of course initially it was invented to extend working hours in factories to make it possible to have 10-hour days and 12-hour days and six days a week, but then gradually it was strung through the streets and through houses, and so different ways of life opened up. And then even things like international trade, just thinking of a local one in Mackay, sugar is grown in Mackay because we were a colony, and the European markets demanded sugar for their tea as a stimulant, and so large tracts of the world were turned over to sugar production to feed this demand of the English and European middle class for stimulants like sugar and tobacco. So essentially drugs that were used. And this is the context in which the social sciences and psychology emerged for the first time. The need for some way of trying to manage this huge change, and to try to understand. The question there, as I flagged, is it's European. What does it mean that so much of social science and psychology was written by researchers in Europe, and with a focus on changes in Europe, with everybody else being seen as sort of backward and needing to catch up with Europe? So how does that impact on our understanding to this day? Psychology is very largely erected on an evidence base that it includes white middle class American undergraduate students. Now there's nothing wrong with using them as research guinea pigs, but the implication is somehow that evidence base that all human beings are the same, and so we can do it on American undergraduates because they're typical, when of course we know that in fact American undergraduates are a very, very specific group of people with their own set of cultural norms and their own history and so on. So it's worth thinking about those things. And as I said, I'll get the key excerpt out of Baraka to illustrate that and put it on the website, but I encourage you to look at the whole movie if you get a chance. So we can see in those social theorists who get mentioned in the Gurmov textbook, their relationship with modernity is about exploring it. There's a piece there from the Communist Manifesto that sort of captures the sorts of things that I've been saying. That was written in 1848. Could easily have been written about changes that are happening now with all these enormous changes with globalization, but he was talking about the 1840s and the enormous changes wrought by mechanization. Max Weber and the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. Why did capitalism emerge in in Europe was the question that people were asking, and he argued that it was that because of Protestant religion that it became possible to think of a Protestant work ethic where people think for most of human history people did work because they had to fulfill their own immediate needs at a subsistence level and maybe have a little bit left over for trade, but for the most part people did work because they had to, and then they went off and relaxed. But in capitalism, we had to convince people to work for very long hours at these machines, and convince them that work for its own sake was a good thing. And he talked about the spirit of capitalism. Time is money, and that's a very specific sort of way of thinking about time and about money. So everything has to be organised, and that reflects the sort of machine culture of the thing. Weber was also very Eurocentric. He said that only Europe had Protestantism, so that's why capitalism emerged there. He also said that Europe was the only place that had real science and real maths and real philosophy. So there was that Eurocentric sort of thing happening. We're aware that capitalism produced these global sorts of changes, and so we can bring that sociological imagination to modernity. We can ask, well, when did it begin? So when I was explaining it to you, I said, well, in those big changes around the French and Industrial Revolutions. But of course it has roots in things that were happening. The Enlightenment goes back a previous century. Colonisation, goes back to the 15th century, 16th century. So there were roots that went further, but there's those two big revolutions that we sort of hang the thing on. What were the new structures? What did they look like? There was a new class. They got rid of the king. The king no longer had the complete say. There wasn't divine right of kings who told everyone. There wasn't lords, who looked after who controlled the land that then the peasants worked on. Women worked in the fields alongside men, but with the rise of capitalism, you got a new class, a capitalist class who now had much more influence in running society. They brought those new rules in about everyone should have a vote. It shouldn't be based on hereditary, aristocracy that inherited these titles. It should be based on your capacity to effectively run a business and be a self-made man. The modern notions of race emerged at the time, a class of workers too, of course, right? Who got driven off the land. They enclosed all the land and forced people into the cities who then had to sell their, instead of working on the land for their own subsistence, and giving a bit to the Lord, they then had to go and sell themselves to someone in a factory who could make a profit out of their labour. So that created those big modern cities with poverty and crime and with the workhouse and systems of trying to force people to work hard and for long hours. And the modern conception of race emerges there too, that we've always had ways of dealing with people who were different. The modern conception of race, the scientific conception of race, is an explanation of why the world was such an unequal place. So there's all the black and brown people in the colonies who were primitives or less modern than humans at least, lacking a real civilization, and all that talk about barbarians and savages as a scientific language for explaining why Europe had won the race, why Europe had modernised and industrialised while other places hadn't. So that developed the notions of white superiority, especially as the process of colonisation got going. If you want to trade with someone, you don't need to worry about any of that, because you just want what he's got and you give him, you just do a trade. But once you colonise someone and the world begins to polarise into the rich and poor and the first and the third world, then you need some rationale for that, and that rationale was the scientific idea of race. Culture, what ideas? Well, we've already talked about a few of them, but liberty, equality, fraternity. For the first time, people felt that individuals should be free, and that there should be some notion of equality and solidarity among people, as opposed to an aristocratic view where the lords had it all their own way. They were blessed by God to rule over society, and then the church, and then the peasants at the bottom, and that was the way it had always been, and that was the way it would always remain. So social change and those kind of notions of equality and working your way up the ladder and so on became real possibilities with the rise of modern capitalism. And then we can do the critique. What were its limitations and what were the pros and cons? Well, I've mentioned massive increase in productivity. People weren't forced to live hand to mouth. There was more wealth, and those rates of productivity made many things much more affordable than ever been. So at one time, silk stockings were, for the elite. It was very expensive to produce them, and whereas once you mechanise that process, eventually anyone, virtually anyone, could have silk stockings. So it became a great democratiser in a way because it made things so cheaply. So that the commodities and capitalism created new freedoms and new rights, and there was the rise of democracy and social movements, people demanding change. Unions arise, said we don't want to, we want reasonable working conditions. We want a 40-hour week. We want to work 5 days. So those changes from 6 and 7 day weeks with 12 and 10 and 12-hour days, 6 days of the week, gradually got shortened. So the labour movement eventually won what you think of as the weekend, but of course in more recent times, with flexible inverted commas hours, you find young people more and more working on weekends. They don't want to pay penalty rates for weekends and so on. So there's a to and fro in it, but those sort of notions that we sort of take for granted are very much a part of modernity. And of course, there's a flip side, a sort of dark side of it, the massive bureaucratisation. That enormous productive power can be used to produce wars. It creates greater polarisation. There was more wealth and more poverty. Issues about sustainability would eventually emerge, as we used more and more of the resources, that we came to associate mass consumption with happiness. There's a very different way a very, very historically unique way in the last 3 lifetimes of saying that, I am what I consume. That sort of thing has to be organised and created, produced in a population. It doesn't just emerge naturally. Liberty, equality and fraternity, of course, turned out always to be, for some, particularly white European males, but it also set up that possibility of expanding those rights. But initially, of course, women, slaves, working class didn't have the same access to the right to vote, the right to an education. And to liberty, equality and fraternity was seen initially as very narrow, but it opened up space in a new way. And we had the rise of colonialism and global polarity. So you've got a core set of economies and a peripheral set of economies, and a homogenisation with everything becoming more and more like the West. So very much China at the moment looking very much like Britain did in Marx's day, with these massive factories and cheap labour and so on. No rights. So how does that work for our assignment? I've tried to direct you to a way of looking at questions by going back in time to when it was different, to sort of challenge that notion that this is the way it's always been, and to challenge and to give you that broader picture of what those changes in modernity were that you probably take for granted. So, but in relation to your assignment, of course, I don't expect you to write the whole history of the world. It's just I think about how did it get to be this way. Think back to when it was different. So, if you're talking to single parents, well, that was a product of the changes in divorce laws in the 1970s when divorce became easier. If you're talking to someone who's unemployed, well, in the 1960s there was full employment. There wasn't an unemployment problem because the economy was booming along. So that employed everybody. There were more women at home, so there was less pressure to find work. So there were those economic changes. What about multicultural policy? If you're talking to someone who's an immigrant or a refugee or something, how does that relate to changes in policy that allowed different groups to come to Australia at different times? What does it mean if they're a white settler? How does that affect the way they see it? Australia had institutionalised racism, from the time of Federation. The first act of the Australian Parliament was to ban Asian migration. How has women's role changed if you're talking to women now, or whatever issues come up? When you say they went to a school, they're working class, and they went to a school, how does that relate to, say, the issue of funding of schools? With different schools, there have been recent debates in the press about school funding, and the richer schools getting more money from the government rather than less, and poorer schools getting less. And Gonski suggesting, well, we should try to leave this out. Young people do more casual work. So where did that come from? What changes have brought about a rise in casual work? And when I was growing up, people, we work Thursday nights and Saturday mornings, whereas now, kids are working, after school from 3 to 6, a couple of nights a week, are expected to work for the weekend without penalty rates. And a 40-hour week job more and more means 40 hours any time it's convenient to the boss. So there's been these changes, which then affect education, of course. Education is what it counts as an education. The purpose of education has become very much more focused on getting a job at the end, and that's of course a perfectly reasonable thing. But the changes that bring that about narrow the focus of education into the job at the end, and the purpose of studying then is not to sort of broaden your mind and make you a better educated person, a better citizen, but a better worker. And so you're doing the skilling you'll need for work, and we can ask about who benefits from that process. Okay, so part B of the lecture will be more on culture, so we'll do that next. Ta.